welcome everybody today. Today is absolutely a wonderful day. Welcome to the Energy News Beat podcast. My name's Stu Turley, CEO and president of the Sandstone Group, and we just have a fabulous talk today. We have Colin Grabow with the Cato Institute, and he is a fellow there. We are so glad to have you here. Thank you very much and welcome.
Stu, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I'll tell you, this is really exciting because I've been out here just kind of yelling around saying, we got to do something to fix pain at the pump. We got to figure out our energy strategies. And I'm over here yelling about something that we're going to talk about is how do we fix the energy policy? And there's a real simple one out there. And Colin, it's the Jones Act. And I look out here and I find that you have been writing about this since 2018. So right. What were you thinking when you wrote this in 2018?
Well, it's interesting. Actually, the first time I wrote about the Jones Act was in, I think, September 2017, right after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. And, you know, when you first look at the Jones Act, so for those unfamiliar, yep. Jones Act, Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which says that the domestic transportation of goods by water has to take place on vessels that are U.S. built, U.S. flagged and registered, U.S. owned, and U.S. crewed. Right. So it seems like a very straightforward law, but when you start digging into it, you realize it has numerous perverse effects in this country. Among those, the distribution, transportation of energy in this country. So that's how I first got into it. But again, the deeper you dig, it's Alice in Wonderland stuff. The more bizarre and interesting it becomes.
Well, I'll tell you what, Colin. You just we were chit-chatting ahead of time just before the podcast, and you're now a fellow. Tell us about your background, how you got to the Cato Institute, because that'll help tee up our listeners for how we got even into the Jones Act and everything else. So tell us a little bit about your history, and congratulations on the fellow.
Well, thank you very much, Stu. So I've been, again, at Cato since September of 2017, so almost 5 years. My background, I graduated from college with a degree in international affairs. I worked for a consulting firm where I wrote about U.S.-Asia relations while I was there. I then went to graduate school, got my master's in international trade. I've always been a big fan of the Cato Institute and free trade. I ended up going to work then for a Japanese investment firm, and I was there for almost, I think, 7 years. Then opportunity presented itself here at Cato, and I could not pass that up to be a professional advocate for free trade. Like I said, first week on the job, I got this opportunity to write about the Jones Act. And the more I dug into it, I said, no one's talking about this. It's not receiving the attention it deserves. This is a big deal. People deserve to know about this. People need to know about this. And I've written about any number of things, but that's been kind of my meat and potatoes, my bread and butter. And I've been at it ever since.
And then I'm over here and I'm making a note because you just got me as I got another question for you. And I was watching the Hannity show the other day, and I like Pete, whoever was filling in for him, better than Hannity. I'll leave that alone. But moving right along. And his guest is the first guest on national TV that I've heard say we could solve a lot of our energy problems with the Jones Act today. That's the first one I've heard, and I'm over here like you yelling around going the Jones Act. How come you talked about it in 2018? You've yelled on all the rooftops, kind of like Fiddler on the Roof, right? Why isn't anybody talking about it? We've had wartime exclusions of the Jones Act. How come we can't do that now?
Yeah, so I will note, in fact, Sean Hannity himself mentioned lifting restrictions on the Jones Act, I think yesterday or the day before. So this week.
Okay.
So Hannity himself, to give credit where it's due, he did mention the Jones Act in the context of energy. So why is it difficult? Well, first, maybe we should talk about how this hurts, the energy industry and, all the
Right.
problems, and then why this, and then we can get into why nothing's been done about this. So what is the issue here? What is wrong with requiring people to use US ships, US built ships? What could be more pro-American than that?
Right.
On the surface, it's a very reasonable, even good law. The issue is that, so the ships have to be built in the United States. Number one, that's a very unusual requirement. If you want to fly across the country, you can fly in an Airbus, foreign built airplane. You can use a foreign built truck to transport
Right.
something, but if it floats, it has to be built here in the United States. Well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is Americans are not very good at building ships. A US built tanker is roughly 4 times more than one built in another country, one built in Asia. So right now, U.S. built tankers at least $150 million for small, medium range tanker. That same tanker over in Asia is like a $40 million ship. Okay. Right. So you have ships that are expensive to build, and then they're expensive to operate too. Right. International ships, they have lower crewing costs. American mariners are paid much more than their foreign counterparts. I believe in 2011, the U.S. Maritime Administration did a study and calculated it's roughly 3 times more expensive to operate a U.S. ship versus a foreign equivalent. So you take ships that are very expensive to build, very expensive to crew. That's a real disincentive to using them. So what happens is you want to send something, some oil, say, to a refinery from the Gulf Coast to the East Coast. It's actually cheaper to send it all the way to Canada than to send it to another part of the United States. So we disincentivize Americans buying American energy because we make the transportation so costly that they will instead use pipelines. In fact, Jones Act tankers are typically only used where you don't find pipelines, like taking refined products to Florida, for example. Florida doesn't have pipelines, or they will import it. They do the math, and it will make more sense to say import oil from Russia to the East Coast than to import it from the Gulf Coast. So we talk about energy independence and American self-reliance, and this is a law that disincentivizes that makes it more difficult for Americans to buy American energy. I mean, all products, but energy in particular. So, and this leads to the question of, well, why isn't, as you said, why hasn't someone done something about this? Right. And it's an age-old story. You find this with all types of protectionism. There's a lobby, there's a group there that profits from this in the context of the Jones Act. So it's going to be the shipbuilders, for example. This is a law that says you have to buy what they make. They love, that's good for them. Bad for the rest of us, but they're big fans, understandably. Also, the unions that crew these ships, they don't want to compete against foreigners. And of course, the ship operators. So you got all these folks together, and they have a significant presence here in Washington, and they are in Capitol Hill all the time, making the case, saying, "Hey, we got this great law. It's totally American. Keeps our shipyards in business. Keeps ships sailing. You should all support it." And the sad reality is that your average American doesn't even know this law exists. So it's very hard to mobilize opposition to it. And so, in the current political context, President Biden has numerous times stated his support for the Jones Act. He, has linkages with unions and tends to take their side on issues, and they support the Jones Act, so he supports the Jones Act. And then on the other side of the aisle, a lot of Republicans, not all, but a decent number, they think, they want to support their local shipyards. Some of them buy into the notion this is critical for national security. And so we come to this point, here we are today, when we've actually made it very difficult for Americans to access American energy because of this law.
And this is so crazy. You wrote this article with I think 1 or 2 others, and your points are so fabulous, Colin, because we talk about there's back in 2018, there was only 7 major, we only have 7 major shipyards, and I believe 4 of them are dedicated to military. We don't have the capacity to even make very many.
So
mean,
yeah, let's talk about this argument that, well, at least it supports U.S. shipbuilding. There hasn't been a Jones Act tanker delivered since, I believe, 2017. So we're
yep.
talking 5 years. We don't build very many ships in this country, commercial ships. On average, since the year 2000, collectively, all U.S. shipyards combined have delivered an average of 3 ships per year. To put that number in context, a single shipyard in Korea can build 60 ships in a year. And we're talking 3. Last year, there were 0 ships delivered in
And
the
you come
entire
in
country
here,
right now. There are 2 ships under construction in the entire country. Those ships were actually supposed to be delivered 2 years ago, but the shipyard has had such a difficult time building these ships that they still haven't been delivered. And then the few ships that are built, this notion that, well, okay, but at least we're not relying on foreigners for our shipbuilding. Oh, yes, we are. Especially the tankers. What they do is these U.S. shipyards, they go to Korea and they will buy their designs from a Korean shipyard, and they'll buy
right?
all the components. And what the American shipyards do is basically do assembly work, taking these components, they build the hull, and they take all the foreign components, the engine, all the things that make the ship actually work, and then they fill it. They there will be ships full of components coming over from Korea for these American shipyards to build the ship. So we
Wow.
don't even get the benefit of having this indigenous shipbuilding capacity, where we don't need to rely on foreigners. We absolutely are reliant on foreigners. The only thing that's really American about these ships is the price tag. Again, four times more for the tanker. Container ships have been estimated cost 5 times more. So it's a crazy situation we find ourselves in.
This is a national security issue. If we ever
That's right.
went to war, I mean, you put in here that back then in 2018, 2,000 shipyards in China, 1,000 in Japan and in Asia and those kind of things. And we have 27, and then we have 4 that are big enough. This is ridiculous.
Yeah, if you look at what's really keeping U.S. shipyards going, it's not the Jones Act commercial work. It's overwhelmingly government orders, mainly for the
Right.
military. In fact, there was a report released, I believe last year by the U.S. Maritime Administration that said, I think in 2020 or 2019, 78% of all shipbuilding industry revenue was from the government. That's the vast majority. You go shipyard by shipyard. Yeah, you mentioned that. I think there are 7 major shipyards. 4 of them are dedicated. Newport News, Bath Iron Works, Electric Boat, General Dynamic, NASCO. Their bread and butter are military ships. Most of those shipyards build exclusively military. All combatant ships are built by shipyards that don't do any commercial work. That's what's keeping the industry going. And even among the shipyards that do build the occasional commercial ship, their mainstay, their bread and butter is typically government contracts. You look at NASCO shipyard, they build tankers. There are 2 shipyards that build tankers in this country. It's General Dynamics, NASCO in San Diego, and the Philly shipyard in Philadelphia.
Right.
Both of those have 0 Jones Act ships under construction right now. 100%. They have some government contracts for some non-combatant vessels. Philly shipyard, I think they will start construction on one commercial ship. It's going to be a rock laying vessel for offshore wind, but that's it.
Wow. When we talk about the EIA has the chart as we're exporting everything out of the Gulf Coast, like Cheniere and everybody else, all the LNG going to Europe, to Asia. That's wonderful exports, but those are all coming out of we're renting all of those tankers. We're renting all of those. There are really no pipelines over to Florida, so we're using small Jones Act tankers that run back and forth across the Gulf of Mexico from the refineries here. So the pipelines that have been denied are keeping the Jones Act little shippers right here just going back and forth. That's the only reason
Exactly.
Florida is not on European pricing, because they're bringing all that pricing in, Colin, just like you described a second ago.
That's right. As a good rule of thumb, Jones Act ships are only used if you have no alternative. So, Florida, again, no pipeline, so you got to use Jones Act tanker. Alaskan oil, there's no pipeline goes from Alaska all the way down the West Coast. So, it goes down to the southern part of Alaska, to Valdez, and then it goes to, the West Coast. Hawaii, I think once a month they'll get in a tanker from the West Coast with refined product. Puerto Rico gets, about one shipment a month from the U.S. mainland, and that's not even ships. That's actually taken in on a barge typically. So the funny thing here, the interesting thing here is that those cases where you get barges, barges, they have no or very little military applicability. In time of war, we're not going to grab our barges to support the military. And this is a case where the Jones Act, it doesn't even generate an actual ship. So it's just kind of a mess all the way around. And you mentioned, of course, LNG. Well, LNG is the craziest of all because we are a top 3 LNG exporter. I blink, we were number 1 at one point recently, and then Qatar, I think, became number 1. We're number 2 right now, something like that. We export LNG all over the world. I think last I checked now, 30 some countries, something like that. We can't send it to Puerto Rico. We cannot send it to New England by ship because there are no Jones Act compliant tankers to transport. The ships don't exist. Now, somebody may think, well, Colin, this is an easy problem to solve. Go build the ship, crew some Americans, and there you go. Except the math doesn't work. According to the Wall Street Journal, to build an LNG tanker in a U.S. shipyard is $700 million. Over in Asia, that's like a $200 million ship. So you're talking $500 million more for one ship. The math doesn't work. And we haven't built one of those ships since the 1970s.
And
so we don't even have the
paying for the difference. Americans, the consumer.
Absolutely. So we're importing it from abroad. Most of it goes to Puerto Rico, and New England comes from Trinidad and Tobago, but we get shipments from elsewhere. Right now, there is a tanker that just left Oman on its way to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico in 2019 imported Russian gas. New England 2018 imported Russian gas. This is insanity. It would actually be easier for Puerto Rico to buy American natural gas if it was an independent country. Being part of the United States makes it more difficult to get American energy because of the Jones Act. That's bad for Puerto Rico, and it's bad for American energy producers.
Colin, here we are on the U.S. side of Henry Hub pricing for natural gas. We're in the $8 now range, and if we weren't exporting everything in, and if we didn't have a current administration trying to kill the E&P or exploration companies, we could drive that price back to where it was, $2.50 for natural gas in that area, and we could pass that back along. You mentioned in this article also that the average age of the fleets is significantly different. Average age, I believe, of shipping in just general shipping is 10 to 11 years, I believe. And then the average age is 30 to 35 years on the Jones ships.
So if you look at Jones Act ships, as we said before, Jones Act ships are very expensive to build. Well, a logical consequence of that is you don't want to replace them. You want to hold on to these things as long as possible because you don't want to have to pay that price for a new ship. So which means that they tend to be older. If you look at the Jones Act container ships, you can find container ships that are over 40 years of age in the fleet right now. To put that in context, you mentioned 10 to 11 years. I know the head of the U.S. Maritime Administration testified before Congress a few years ago, and he said in the commercial world, it's rare to see ships beyond 15 to 20 years of age. Now, the Jones Act tankers are an unusual exception. Jones Act tankers are younger. I want to say their average is around 13, 14 years of age.
Okay.
But that's kind of an asterisk to it. A couple of reasons for that. Number one, after the Exxon Valdez disaster back in the early 90s, there was the oil pollution, or I'm sorry, it was 89, I think. There was the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 was passed, which mandated that all ships operating in the U.S. had to be double hulled. So a lot of the single hulled ships, they all had to be scrapped and they had to be replaced. And they had to get that done by, I think, 2015 was the deadline for that. So that encouraged the construction of new ships. And then, of course, we also had the big fracking boom. And at the time, we had the oil export ban. So you had to move this oil, which means you had to use Jones Act ships. So there are a bunch of new tankers built within the last 10 years for all that fracked oil. But what's happened now is, again, as I mentioned earlier, we haven't built a new tanker in like 5 years. So what we're going to see is all those tankers are going to get older and older. And even if you place an order today for a new ship, you couldn't get it delivered until 2026 because of the lack of availability at U.S. shipyards. So we're going to see those Jones Act ship tankers that are not too old right now, but they're going to see block obsolescence because we're not seeing an influx of new tankers into the fleet.
See, what you're describing with your expertise is describing that even with demand destruction, let's say that we have demand destruction when we have natural gas for heating and everything else, people are going to turn their AC off or anything like that. You're going to pass that point because you're not going to be able to ship anything with natural gas and all that. The cost as that fleet gets, you start shutting those things off and they are going to go out of there. We have 70 whatever. I mean, the numbers in your thing are just frightening because as we start losing those ships, the cost of energy goes up.
And we are losing ships. We've had 2 tankers scrapped in the last several months, I believe. We used to have 57 tankers. We're down to, I think, 55 right now. And again, nothing's being built. I mentioned there's a total absence of LNG tankers. Same thing with propane, LPG,
yes.
Liquefied petroleum gas. There are 0 tankers capable of transporting that. So again, Hawaii, New England, they have to import. Hawaii, they import from as far away as West Africa, even though we are the largest exporter of LPG in the world, large propane exporter, but Americans can't get it because there are no ships.
This is about the most ludicrous thing I've heard. Well, I got a few jokes about what my wife calls me. So, but anyway, when we sit back and take a look, the wartime exemptions have been said, okay, great. We're at war. We have an energy crisis. We're facing unbelievable inflation. New England has been buying oil and LNG from sanctioned countries for years. California is doing the same thing. They're buying the last 5 years, I believe the number was 20% of their number came in from Iran or another sanctioned country. Why is the United States buying from sanctioned countries? Because of the Jones Act.
Yeah, and even beyond sanctioned countries, I've seen examples of California. They'll import from as far away as Nigeria rather than the Gulf Coast, because again, the Jones Act just ruins the economics of it. I saw a report from the government of California, some energy commission, I believe, that said it was cheaper to import gasoline from Singapore than from Houston. It's absolutely crazy.
And when I put a crayon on this and you start taking a look, we saw in Mendocino this weekend, it was $9 a gallon in California for gas. So by the time you take a number and you start calculating out no pipelines, nothing coming in, nothing over here, we're going to see, and I put my little crystal ball over here, $14 diesel. That is going to then snowball around into more inflation, more everything else. And it's because Europe is in a real serious diesel problem right now. So because the East Coast is now having to buy LNG at European prices, Germany just got their first LNG offshore so they can start I'm from Texas, degasifying, and they're all happy about that. One is not going to free you from Russian natural gas. How do we get a wartime exclusion? You,
So there are, so if you want to get a waiver of the Jones Act or some exemption from the Jones Act, if you want to get a waiver, the president has some authority to do this. There are two types of waivers. Number one,
okay,
president through the Secretary of Defense can request a Jones Act waiver in the
right.
interest of national security. The other way you can get a waiver is that we saw this actually during the Colonial Pipeline outage last year. There were two Jones Act waivers granted. These are waivers where someone else, say from the commercial sector, requests a waiver and says, I want to move this from point A to point B.
Right.
And this is in our national security interest. Can I do it? So these are the two types of waivers. Now, if Biden wanted to issue a waiver, say for LNG, unfortunately, his hands have been further tied because in 2020, the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act contained new language about further restricting these waivers, saying not only did it have to be in the interest of national security, but in direct support of a military operation. Well, why would Congress
that was
do
a good
this?
idea?
Yeah, why would Congress do this? I think it's because in 2019, some of President Trump's advisors went to him and said, President Trump, we think you should waive the Jones Act for LNG shipments for 10 years.
Right.
Because so Americans can access American LNG. And President Trump, according to news reports, was leaning in favor of it. Well, the next week, 6 Republican senators, both senators from Louisiana, Mississippi, Alaska, plus Steve Scalise went to the White House and said, don't do this, don't touch the Jones Act. And President Trump backed off and did not issue that waiver. I think that scared the daylights out of some of these Jones Act folks, and that's what prompted the revised language, the NDAA. So it's very difficult right now for the administration to grant waivers, given those restrictions, given it has to be for national security. And then even if a waiver is granted, they're limited to 10 days with extensions up to, you can extend a few times up to a maximum, I think, of 45 days. But if, Russia, Ukraine, I don't think this is going away anytime soon. So we need something longer term, and either Congress needs to revisit that waiver language, or Congress itself needs to act to change the law and grant some exemptions. The good news is at the end of March, Representative Scott Perry of Pennsylvania introduced a bill that would exempt all energy shipments from the Jones Act.
Nice.
That seems like a very common sense move. Unfortunately, I don't think he's attracted any co-sponsors, but when he introduced this, he pointed, I said, this is crazy. We've imported LNG from Russia in the past.
Right.
We can't buy our own LNG because of this law. This isn't in our national security interest. This is in our economic interest. This is in nobody's interest. We need to do something about this.
Wow. Normally I got a good joke of just about everything, but this is not jokeable. How do we take the Cato Institute? Because the number one problem with energy companies is they never really broadcasted the goodness of what they do. Yes, they have been doing things bad in the past. They've cleaned up their act a lot by, like, Texas has really killed flaring before they even had the regulations and everything else. So the EMP companies are now giving money back to their investors rather than waiting 10 years in order to do it. So the ESG movement has had some positive things on the oil and gas industry. But how in the world can we take your expertise, the Cato Institute, the might of the Cato Institute, and create something that needs to happen with education and then get it changed? How do we get Ted Cruz, me and you and Ted Cruz, to talk about this?
Well, Ted Cruz, to his credit, he also introduced legislation amendment, I believe, a month or two ago, right, during some markup, and he tried to exempt LNG shipments. Actually, he didn't try to exempt. He said, let's create a waiver system, if I recall correctly. So that if, I want to move something from point A to point B, and there is no Jones Act ship, and there is none when it comes to LNG, then you can use a foreign flag ship, and you can do so for economic reasons. Because again, currently you can only get a waiver in the interest of national security. So he would say, no, let's create a waiver system for also just for economics. If there is no Jones Act ship available, you should be able to use a foreign flagship. So, and he said, the moment that a Jones Act LNG tanker gets built, this will go away, because then you can say, no, actually there are Jones Act ships available. You don't get the waiver. But until that time, let's create a path for Americans to access American energy. He submitted that as amendment, and I believe it failed 24-2. Something like that, which is stunning. The only other person that voted for it was Senator Mike Lee of Utah, who he's actually introduced legislation to repeal the Jones Act entirely. But so what I think is going on here is there is a lack of understanding, because all the facts and the logic are on our side. Again, if this went through, nobody in the maritime industry loses their job over this, because again, this is not a service they offer. They don't. That's the whole point of the waiver. So they are no worse off. They just don't want, frankly, the precedent of seeing Jones Act waivers. And I think that once people got a taste for this, and they saw, wow, look at the cost savings I'm realizing, we should see what else we can waive from this law. I think that's what they're scared of. But on its merits, it makes no sense, their position. But I think we need an education effort. I think people, including on Capitol Hill, are ignorant of this. The only understanding most of them have is what they're told by Jones Act lobbyists. You have to understand your average congressional staffer, they're responsible for, tax policy, trade policy, healthcare, like 3 or 4 different issues. They don't have time to become an expert on every single aspect of it. And a lot of them just don't know any better. So there has to be an education effort made. And the U.S. energy industry, I have not seen much evidence of them here on Capitol Hill. They do have lobbyists, of course, but I think a lot of their efforts are more defensive oriented and trying to prevent things from getting worse. They're playing defense a lot. But taking the offense and saying, well, let's make things better. I don't think we've seen as much of that. And certainly on the Jones Act, I've not seen much from them, which is unfortunate.
This is nuts. Okay, so you're the smart guy in the room. I mean, you're the adult in the room, I should say. And let's see if we can't figure out a way to get Ted Cruz. Let's get a few more legislators on here, and let's go educate people, because the folks that get educated really can help understand, and it's a snowball. Nobody has been, that is something that the energy companies failed. For years, and I have put myself in there as well, we didn't educate people on the number one way to get people out of poverty is low cost energy. And I believe that we should use every form of energy that we can. Wind, solar, nuclear, I don't care. Let the markets decide. Let's get the lowest cost power to everybody on the planet with the least amount of impact on the environment. That seems logical.
Absolutely. Well, Stu, I think unfortunately, we're all about to get a big education in the importance of energy. I think Americans have taken low cost energy kind of for granted, and we're going to find out what expensive energy does and what all the ramifications are. You talked about, I think, $14 a gallon diesel. I hope that doesn't happen, but my goodness, even if we get anywhere close to that, the ramifications for the broader economy are tremendous. So I'm hoping that maybe one silver lining here is that people will start to wake up. You can indulge in this Jones Act protectionism in an era of cheap energy, where even if you factor in the inefficiencies, at the end of the day, we're still not in a bad place.
Right.
But it becomes a much more serious, I think, discussion. And this Jones Act indulgence is much more expensive and costly in the current environment that we're in. So hopefully this can be a moment to educate people and wake a few people up.
Wow. All right. I'm going to stay in touch with you. I'm sorry, Colin, I'm going to bug you. But even if, let's say that President Biden puts a ban on export of LNG, the Jones Act, and all that's going to do is draw natural gas back down. We're going to be back probably to $5, for natural gas. but the East Coast is still going to be importing from Oman, Russia, Norway. Norway is one of their buyers. This
I
is
think
like,
Nigeria. Yeah,
um,
yeah.
I was
That's
in a
not going
discussion.
away. Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
get, anyway. So even if we ban exports to lower the price, it's going to do nothing.
Absolutely nothing. And, you talk about New England, I think it's particularly unfortunate in the case of Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico is one of the poorest parts of the United States. This is a territory that has a 43% poverty rate. They,
Right.
according to the Energy Information Administration, they are paying, I think, top three, maybe number one, highest electricity rates in the country. And we make it more expensive for them to buy natural gas. They cannot access cheap US natural gas. They can't get the best bargain. So this is, again, it's bad for US energy producers. We're making Puerto Rico pay artificially high prices for energy for one of the poorest parts of the country. This is crazy. It's not serving the interests of anybody.
Colin, you are truly, I am so happy for you being a new fellow at the Cato Institute. Congratulations. I love your work. And I'll tell you what, I love your authoring of this. And thank you for your insights so much. What is coming around the corner for you at the Cato Institute? What's next for Colin?
Well, I will say that we're talking about the Jones Act and energy, and something in the next few weeks that we're going to try to get published is an examination of the Jones Act's impact just strictly on Puerto Rico. We talked a lot about LNG, but it's all types of fuel. It is diesel, it's refined products, it's across the board. They are paying artificially high prices because of this law, and they are in large part cut off from US energy because of this. So we're going to kind of do a deep dive. We're going to do like a comparison between them and neighboring Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic is buying more American energy than Puerto Rico is, again, because Puerto Rico is part of the United States and thus subject to the Jones Act. So that's one they're going to have coming down the pike. I think your listeners that are energy focused may have a particular interest in.
I'll tell you what, I hope you don't mind coming back, and I hope you don't mind me bugging you, because I want to get the word out there and help save American consumers. So thank you very much for stopping by the podcast today, Colin.
Stu, thank you. I've enjoyed it tremendously. I love talking about this stuff, and I hope we can do it again.
Sounds great.